What if everything you thought you knew about the royal family was a lie? What if the image of loyalty, honor, and family values that has been broadcast to the world for decades was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade? Imagine for a moment that the very foundations of this seemingly untouchable institution could be shaken by a single, private revelation, a secret that, until now, nobody outside a small circle dared to whisper. This isn't just about scandal. This is about betrayal, about family torn apart by truths too heavy to bear, and about two children whose lives were irrevocably changed before they even fully understood what it meant to be royalty. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins with a phone call, a casual enough event that would set in motion a chain of events so explosive it would ripple through palaces, tabloids, and living rooms across the globe. In that instant, one man's world shifted completely, and the quiet, controlled image of a happy royal family started to crack. That man was Prince Harry, a prince whose life has been anything but ordinary. From the very beginning, Harry's story has been shaped by privilege, expectations, and scrutiny the likes of which few people can imagine. But even for someone who has lived under such relentless public attention, nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover about his own children. It started with a DNA test, a simple, clinical, objective tool, but the results it returned were anything but ordinary. The numbers and sequences printed on that sheet of paper carried consequences that would ripple through Harry's life and his family forever. When he read those results, he realized that the paternity of his children, Archie and Lilibet, was no longer a private certainty. It was a question mark that would force him to confront the unimaginable. And the person who held the key to that truth was none other than his own wife, Meghan Markle. Imagine, for a moment, the tension in a room when someone says, "I'm sorry I lied." 3 words, but in the context of the royal family, and in the context of secrets surrounding your own children, those words carry a weight so heavy that it feels almost physical. Meghan's confession wasn't a quiet whisper. It was a shattering moment, an emotional explosion that left no one in the room untouched. Harry, known for his courage and resilience, was suddenly confronted with a choice. Could he forgive this, or was the betrayal too deep, the wound too raw? To understand why this moment mattered so profoundly, we have to step back and look at the bigger picture. Harry and Meghan have always been under intense scrutiny, their lives dissected by millions, their every move analyzed and criticized. The couple's decision to step back from royal duties was already controversial, but this revelation added a dimension no one could have predicted. It wasn't just about fame, money, or media pressure. It was about truth, trust, and the very essence of family. And when that truth came to light, the consequences were immediate, personal, and devastating. But the drama didn't stop there. The palace, that ancient institution built on centuries of tradition and secrecy, now found itself facing a crisis unlike anything in its long history. Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles, and Prince William were suddenly not just distant observers. They were actors in a drama they could neither control nor contain. Every conversation, every private meeting, every whispered warning suddenly took on a new weight. Alliances shifted, loyalties were questioned, and the walls that once protected the family's reputation began to crumble. And then there were the children, Archie and Lilibet, innocent in the midst of an adult storm, whose lives were about to be shaped by revelations beyond their understanding. The implications for them were staggering. Custody, upbringing, identity, all now entangled in a web of secrecy and betrayal. What does it mean for a child to grow up in a world where even the most basic truths about their family are in question? How do you navigate love and trust when the very people you rely on most are entangled in lies? These are questions that Harry, Meghan, and the entire royal household would soon have to confront. The media frenzy that followed was immediate. Tabloids and news outlets scrambled to report every angle, every whisper, every speculation. Social media exploded with opinions, rumors, and heated debates. The public, always fascinated by the inner workings of the royal family, was given a story that was stranger than fiction. And yet, even as headlines screamed and commentators pontificated, the full story remained just out of reach, a tantalizing puzzle that promised more revelations with each passing day. But perhaps the most compelling part of this story is the human element. Behind the headlines, behind the public statements and the social media outrage, are real people dealing with real emotions: shame, guilt, anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Meghan's tears, Harry's rage, the Queen's measured concern, William's quiet fury. These are not just dramatic beats in a story. They are the lived experiences of a family in crisis. And it is within these moments that we find the true gravity of the revelations, the real stakes, and the emotional core that will drive this story forward. You might be asking yourself, how could such a revelation come to pass? How could a couple like Harry and Meghan, who seem to be in control of their narrative, be blindsided by such a fundamental truth about their family? The answer lies in the complex interplay of secrecy, pride, love, and fear. Secrets, after all, have a way of persisting, growing in power, until they can no longer be contained. And when they finally surface, the impact can be catastrophic, especially when those secrets touch the lives of the most vulnerable. In the coming chapters, we will explore every facet of this story. We will trace the events leading up to the DNA revelation, examine the personal and public reactions, and uncover the hidden dynamics within the royal family that made this scandal possible. You will see the moments of tension, the private confessions, the calculated strategies, and the raw, unfiltered emotions that played out behind closed doors. And at every turn, you will be faced with the same question that Harry had to confront. What do you do when the truth changes everything you thought you knew? This isn't just a story about scandal. It's a story about identity, loyalty, and the fragile bonds that hold families together. It's about how even the most seemingly invincible institutions can be shaken by the power of truth. It's about the cost of deception, the courage required to confront it, and the aftermath that follows when lies are exposed. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the human experience, the fear, the hope, the love, and the heartbreak that define us all. And yet, despite the shock, despite the tears and confessions, despite the media frenzy, one question remains unanswered. What comes next? How will Harry, Meghan, and their children move forward in a world where the foundation of their family has been questioned so publicly? Will forgiveness be possible, or is the rift permanent? And what of the monarchy itself? Can it survive the ripple effects of this revelation? Or is this the beginning of a new era, one defined not by tradition, but by scandal and transparency? But before we answer those questions, we need to go back to the beginning, to the calm before the storm. Because in order to understand why this revelation was so catastrophic, we first need to understand the context, the pressures, the dynamics, and the relationships that set the stage for this seismic moment. Only then can we fully appreciate the magnitude of what Harry discovered, the gravity of Meghan's confession, and the chain of events that would leave no one untouched. The stage is set. The players are ready. The truth, once revealed, would not only reshape the lives of a family, but also send shockwaves through the world. And as we dive into the story, keep this question in mind. If everything you believed about those closest to you could be proven false in an instant, how would you respond? How far would you go to protect your children, your legacy, and your own sense of self? What if the perfect life you had imagined was nothing more than an illusion? That's the question Prince Harry must have asked himself countless times in the months leading up to the revelation that would shake his world. On the surface, everything looked flawless. A prince who had endured childhood tragedy, a bride whose rise to fame seemed almost storybook, and two young children who represented the hope of a new generation. But beneath the polished smiles and carefully staged photographs, tension had been simmering, quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It all began long before the DNA results ever existed, long before Meghan's confession echoed in the halls of palaces and whispered through private messages. Harry and Meghan's early days of marriage were fraught with challenges, both expected and unexpected. From the moment Meghan walked into the royal fold, the couple had faced scrutiny on an unprecedented scale. Every glance, every word, every minor misstep was analyzed by the public and the press. The media narrative painted a picture of fairy tale romance, but the reality behind palace walls was far more complex. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your life was being evaluated not just by your friends and family, but by millions of strangers who believe they had a right to your personal story. Now, layer on top of that the intricate web of royal protocol, traditions, and unspoken rules, some centuries old, some practically unbreakable. For Harry, who had always valued freedom and authenticity, this environment was suffocating. And while Meghan brought with her a sense of modernity and individuality, that same spirit would clash with the entrenched structures of the monarchy. There were signs early on that all was not as perfect as it seemed. Quiet arguments behind closed doors, tension during public appearances that made even casual observers sense something was off. A look exchanged between Harry and Meghan that spoke volumes more than their perfectly posed smiles ever could. These were the small cracks, subtle and easy to dismiss, but they were indicators of the strain building quietly beneath the surface. During this period, Harry's relationship with his family was already under stress. Years of grief, loss, and unresolved tension had created a distance that was never fully bridged. His relationship with William, though framed publicly as brotherly solidarity, carried undertones of rivalry and disappointment. Their father, Prince Charles, represented another layer of complexity. Expectations, judgment, and the weight of tradition hung like a shadow over Harry's every decision. Into this already tense environment stepped Meghan, a woman from a different culture, different country, and different expectations. The friction was inevitable, but what no one could predict was how it would culminate in a revelation that would shake the very foundation of their family. In the calm before the storm, Harry tried to maintain a sense of balance. He focused on his family, the children, and his role as a husband and father. He tried to shield Archie and Lilibet from the pressures of public life, to create a bubble of safety within a world that often seemed cruel and unforgiving. Yet, even as he worked to protect them, the pressures of the palace, the scrutiny of the media, and the unresolved tensions with his relatives created an environment where secrets could fester and small lies could grow into something uncontrollable. Meghan, too, was navigating her own challenges. She had entered a world steeped in tradition, expectation, and rigid social norms. Public opinion weighed heavily on her, and the constant media scrutiny created a level of stress that was both personal and public. But beyond the headlines, there were deeper struggles. The pressure to conform, to maintain appearances, and to protect her family sometimes collided with her own need for authenticity and honesty. These internal conflicts, kept largely hidden from the world, were the tinder that would ignite a blaze the moment the first revelation came to light. The calm before the storm was deceptive. Outwardly, Harry and Meghan appeared united, strong, and composed. They attended public engagements, posed for photographs, and fulfilled their royal duties with precision. The public saw a couple in love, devoted parents, and rising figures in the modern monarchy. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was tense, punctuated by private disagreements, moments of doubt, and the occasional fearful glance toward a world that could expose them at any moment. In hindsight, there were warning signs that nobody, not even those closest to them, could have fully understood. Conversations about family, loyalty, and the future often ended in frustration or silent tension. Hints of discomfort around certain topics hinted at truths that had yet to surface. And while the public assumed that all was well, the reality was that the ground beneath Harry and Meghan's carefully constructed life was unstable, and it would soon give way in a way that no one could have foreseen. It was during this period of quiet tension that the first ripples of the revelation began to appear. A seemingly routine DNA test, something conducted with clinical precision and scientific objectivity, would soon become the catalyst for a personal and public upheaval. But before that moment arrived, Harry and Meghan existed in a state of fragile equilibrium, a balance that would soon be shattered. Imagine, for a moment, walking through the halls of your home, feeling the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on you. Every glance, every word carries meaning, but some meanings are hidden, unspoken, dangerous. That was Harry's life during this period. Every interaction was a negotiation, every conversation a careful dance to avoid confrontation, every decision weighed against potential fallout. It was a life lived on edge, a calm that existed only because the storm had not yet broken. And then came the moment that would destroy the calm. A phone call, a meeting, a private conversation. The exact details are still obscured, but the impact was undeniable. In that instant, the quiet tension became a tidal wave of emotion, confusion, and betrayal. The DNA results confirmed something that Harry had feared, but had never fully allowed himself to confront. The foundation of his family, the certainty of his children's paternity, was now in question. The revelation did not exist in a vacuum. It triggered a chain reaction, affecting not only Harry and Meghan but the entire royal family. The palace, long a symbol of stability, found itself in uncharted territory. Conversations that had been private became urgent and fraught with tension. Decisions that had once seemed straightforward were now laden with implications that could affect generations. And through it all, the children remained at the center of the storm, their lives unknowingly caught in the crossfire. As Harry absorbed the news, he faced a decision unlike any he had encountered before. How do you reconcile love and betrayal, trust and doubt, responsibility and rage? The choices he made in the hours and days that followed would shape not only his future but the future of his family. And yet, even as he acted, the full scope of the consequences remained unseen, lurking just beyond the horizon. Meghan's role in the unfolding drama added another layer of complexity. Her confession, delivered in private but charged with raw emotion, brought relief, guilt, and heartbreak all at once. "I'm sorry I lied," she said, a simple statement with consequences that no one could have fully anticipated. For Harry, the words were devastating. For the children, they were unknowable, yet they would eventually feel the effects in ways that could not be undone. This chapter in Harry and Meghan's lives represents the final days of calm before the storm. Every interaction, every conversation, every decision was now infused with tension, suspicion, and a sense of impending upheaval. And as the days turned into weeks, the quiet moments of domestic life became a backdrop for what was about to explode into public view. The calm before the storm, by its nature, is fragile. It can be maintained only as long as secrets remain hidden, as long as lies are unspoken, and as long as the pressures of expectation do not reach a breaking point. For Harry and Meghan, that equilibrium lasted only until the DNA results shattered it completely. What if the truth you thought you knew about your own children was suddenly thrown into question? Imagine opening a file, glancing at the numbers and sequences, and realizing that the world you had carefully built, the life you thought secure, might actually be a house of cards. That is exactly the shock that hit Prince Harry, a moment so seismic that it would reverberate through his private life, the royal family, and the world at large. It began quietly and innocuously with a DNA test. A test that, in ordinary circumstances, would be routine, clinical, and almost mundane. But this was anything but ordinary. The story of the DNA test starts not with science, but with suspicion. Somewhere along the way, whispers of doubt had begun to surface. Perhaps they were subtle. A conversation overheard, an odd behavior, a passing comment that lingered longer than expected. Perhaps it was instinct. That gut feeling every parent sometimes has when something doesn't quite add up. Whatever the catalyst, Harry and Meghan found themselves at a crossroads. They could either continue in blissful ignorance, or they could confront a truth that no one, not even the closest confidants, could fully anticipate. The decision to take a DNA test is rarely made lightly. There is a gravity to it, a recognition that science can uncover realities that emotions alone cannot handle. For Harry, it was more than just a procedure. It was a confrontation with fear itself. The test represented a boundary, a point of no return. Once the results were known, there would be no going back. The only question was whether he was ready to face what lay hidden beneath the surface of his family life. Meanwhile, Meghan grappled with her own complex emotions. The decision to undergo the test was not hers alone. It was a choice that implicated both parents, the children, and the fragile equilibrium of their marriage. She had spent years navigating public perception, balancing the glare of the media with the intimate realities of family life. Now, the very core of that life was about to be examined under an unflinching, scientific lens. And she knew that the results, when they arrived, would carry consequences far beyond what any laboratory report could quantify. The testing process itself was unremarkable in appearance, discreet, clinical, handled with professionalism. Samples were collected, meticulously documented, and sent to a laboratory with assurances of confidentiality. But while the process was routine, the atmosphere around it was anything but. The tension in the household was palpable. Harry and Meghan navigated each day with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. Every glance, every interaction, every small misstep became magnified, interpreted as a sign or symptom of the anxiety building quietly beneath the surface. As the days stretched into weeks, anticipation grew. Every passing hour heightened the emotional stakes. Harry, normally composed and measured even under immense public pressure, found himself grappling with an internal storm of fear, doubt, and dread. What if the results contradicted everything he had believed? What if they shattered not only his sense of family, but also his identity as a father? And Meghan, who had carried the secret, who had borne the weight of what was about to be revealed, struggled with a gnawing anxiety that would eventually culminate in confession. Finally, the moment arrived. The results were in. Harry opened the envelope, or perhaps accessed the secure digital file, and what he saw immediately reshaped his reality. Numbers, sequences, and codes that most people would never understand had a clarity that cut straight to the heart. The paternity of his children, Archie and Lilibet, was no longer a certainty. The scientific truth, cold and objective, confronted him with a reality that he could not ignore. The impact was immediate and visceral. Harry felt a combination of shock, anger, disbelief, and profound grief. It wasn't just the result itself, it was the implications. The DNA confirmation called into question trust, loyalty, and the very foundation of his family. It was one thing to deal with rumors or public scrutiny. It was another entirely to face an undeniable truth that came from the most objective of sources. This was no longer speculation. This was fact, and the fact was devastating. But the story didn't end with Harry's private shock. Meghan, whose role in the unfolding drama was central, faced her own reckoning. She had known more than she had shared, and the weight of secrecy had reached a breaking point. When she finally spoke, tears streaming down her face, she said words that would haunt the prince for years. "I'm sorry I lied." 3 words, spoken in private, but carrying consequences that would ripple through the family and eventually, the world. It was a moment of confession, of emotional vulnerability, and of irreversible change. The ripple effects of the revelation spread quickly. Even before the information became public, it altered the dynamics between Harry and Meghan. Trust, once assumed, had to be renegotiated. Conversations that had once been casual now carried layers of meaning. The couple's private life, which had always been carefully guarded, became a terrain of tension, negotiation, and emotional volatility. Each interaction was now shadowed by the knowledge of what had been hidden and what could never be unlearned. Meanwhile, the broader context of the royal family loomed in the background. The palace, accustomed to managing crises with discretion and decorum, suddenly faced a scenario it was ill-equipped to handle. The implications of the DNA results were not limited to Harry and Meghan. They had the potential to destabilize relationships across the family. Allegiances would be tested, loyalties questioned, and old tensions revived. Every conversation, every private meeting, every glance exchanged between family members could now carry the weight of this revelation. In the days that followed, Harry began to process the reality of what he had learned. There were moments of intense reflection, long walks alone, and private discussions with advisors and confidants. He grappled with questions of identity, responsibility, and the ethical dimensions of the situation. How does one navigate love and trust when fundamental truths have been challenged? How does a father protect his children when the very concept of paternity has been brought into question? And how do you reconcile loyalty to your family with the need to confront uncomfortable realities? The public, of course, was unaware of the full scope of events at this stage. Headlines had yet to emerge, interviews had not yet aired, and social media speculation had not yet reached its peak. But even in private, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation and unease. Everyone involved, Harry, Meghan, and the inner circle of the family. Knew that the information was volatile, a potential powder keg that could ignite at any moment. And then came the question that would haunt Harry more than any other. What to do next? Confrontation was inevitable, but timing was everything. He could approach Meghan with anger, with accusation, with despair, or he could navigate the revelation strategically, with careful consideration for the children, for himself, and for the broader family dynamics. Every choice carried consequences, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been in his life. The unexpected DNA test was more than a medical procedure. It was a turning point, a revelation that altered the trajectory of Harry and Meghan's lives in ways that could not be reversed. It brought to the surface emotions long suppressed: fear, betrayal, guilt, and a desperate need for clarity. And it set the stage for the decisions that would follow, decisions that would not only affect the couple, but also redefine relationships across the royal family and reshape public perception of one of the most famous families in the world. As Harry grappled with the implications, the emotional weight of the revelation became almost unbearable. Sleep became elusive. Conversations were interrupted by silence, each person wary of speaking the wrong word. The quiet moments of domestic life, once a refuge, were now filled with tension, suspicion, and the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been uncovered. Every glance, every touch, every word was filtered through the lens of the DNA results. And yet, in the midst of the turmoil, there was clarity. Harry understood that the truth, once revealed, had to be faced head-on. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The choices he made in the days and weeks that followed would define not only his relationship with Meghan and their children, but also his relationship with his family, the public, and ultimately, himself. He knew, the moment the DNA results were in his hands, that nothing would ever be the same. The quiet certainty that had defined his life, his family, his role as a father, his trust in Meghan, was gone, replaced by a storm of emotions. Disbelief, rage, heartbreak, and a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. Prince Harry, the man who had faced loss, scrutiny, and public vilification with courage, now faced a personal crisis that cut deeper than any headline or public scandal ever could. Imagine for a moment the weight of that decision pressing down on him. He was not only grappling with the truth of his children's paternity, but also the reality that the person he had trusted most, his wife, the mother of his children, had concealed that truth. How do you reconcile love and loyalty when the foundation of your family has been called into question? How do you continue forward when trust, the most basic currency in any relationship, has been violated in the most intimate way imaginable? Harry's mind raced through a labyrinth of possibilities. He thought about the children, Archie and Lilibet, innocent and unaware, whose lives would be irrevocably shaped by this revelation. Could he protect them? Could he shield them from the fallout? And yet, as a father, he understood that secrets have a way of surfacing, and that avoidance would only exacerbate the damage. Every instinct he had screamed that action was necessary, but what action would do the least harm while asserting the truth he now held? At the same time, Harry grappled with the implications for himself. The royal family, with its centuries-old traditions, its rigid hierarchies, and its unyielding expectations, loomed over every decision. To confront Meghan publicly, or even privately, would set off consequences that could not be undone. To act impulsively might protect his emotions, but devastate the children, the family, and his own reputation. The calculus of betrayal, love, and duty was complex, and every path seemed fraught with peril. And then came the moment of clarity. Harry realized that in order to protect himself, his children, and, ultimately, the truth, he had to take a decisive step. It would be shocking. It would be dramatic. It would irrevocably change his relationship with Meghan, his family, and the institution of the monarchy itself. But he understood that hesitation was no longer an option. The DNA results had made certainty impossible, and inaction would only prolong the agony and allow secrets to fester further. He made the choice. He cut ties. Not partially, not conditionally, but fully. The ties that had bound him to his family, the palace, and the royal obligations that had shaped his entire adult life were severed. The decision was more than symbolic. it was absolute. This was not a temporary estrangement or a cooling-off period. This was a declaration that the betrayal he had uncovered could not be reconciled with the life he intended to lead. The shock of his decision reverberated through the palace. Conversations that had once been routine became tense negotiations. Allies and confidants scrambled to understand his intentions. Those who had been close found themselves suddenly on the outside. And while Harry may have been prepared for the emotional fallout, the wider consequences, public, familial, and political, were only beginning to emerge. For Meghan, the impact was immediate and devastating. She had confessed privately, but the enormity of Harry's reaction was something even she had not fully anticipated. Tears flowed freely, apologies were whispered, and attempts to explain, justify, or mitigate were met with the quiet but unyielding determination of a man who had reached his limit. "I'm sorry I lied," she had said, but the truth of those words was now entangled in consequences far larger than personal guilt. Harry's decision was clear. The betrayal could not be ignored, and trust could not be restored, not without an enormous cost. The children, too, were affected, even if they did not yet understand the full implications. The household, once a place of relative calm, became a space of tension and emotional volatility. Every decision about schooling, public appearances, and family interactions was now weighed against the backdrop of this revelation. Harry, for all his resilience and experience, felt the weight of responsibility like never before. His role as a father now included not only protection but also the difficult task of navigating his own heartbreak while maintaining stability for his children. The public remained unaware, but the palace was abuzz with speculation. Advisors, staff, and family members struggled to anticipate the fallout. The DNA revelation, coupled with Harry's decisive response, created a ripple effect that touched every corner of royal life. The Queen, Prince Charles, and Prince William were forced to reconsider their strategies, manage potential media leaks, and navigate a family dynamic that had become suddenly volatile. Every move was scrutinized, every word analyzed, and yet, the full picture remained hidden, known only to Harry and Meghan and a handful of trusted confidants. In the days that followed, Harry's life became a balancing act between private anguish and public expectation. He continued to fulfill certain responsibilities, but his interactions were now heavily mediated by the reality of what he had discovered. Every decision carried weight. Every conversation was filtered through the lens of trust and betrayal, and every action had long-term implications for both his family and his public persona. The decision to cut ties was both liberating and isolating. On one hand, Harry experienced a sense of relief, a clarity that came from taking control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his influence. On the other hand, he faced loneliness, estrangement, and the painful realization that the people closest to him had been complicit in deception. The emotional toll was immense, a mixture of grief, rage, and cautious optimism for a future where he could reclaim agency over his life. And yet, even as Harry asserted his decision, he knew that this was only the beginning. Cutting ties was the first step, but the path forward was uncertain. How would Meghan respond? How would the children process the changes? How would the family, the palace, and the public react when the truth inevitably emerged? Every possibility seemed simultaneously terrifying and inevitable, a reminder that once a decision of this magnitude is made, there is no retreat, no undoing. The consequences extended beyond personal relationships. The royal institution itself, an entity built on centuries of continuity, tradition, and public trust, faced a crisis. The revelation of the DNA results, coupled with Harry's decisive action, challenged the carefully constructed narrative of unity and loyalty. Advisors and family members had to navigate not only personal emotions, but also the broader implications for monarchy, succession, and public perception. Every decision, every statement, every step forward became a calculated move in a game whose rules had been upended. Through it all, Harry maintained his focus on the children. He understood that their well-being was paramount, that they would be the silent witnesses to a drama they could not yet comprehend. Protecting them meant more than shielding them from the truth. It meant creating a sense of stability in the midst of upheaval, ensuring that their lives, though affected by scandal, remained grounded in love and care. Yet, even as he acted with purpose and clarity, the emotional landscape remained treacherous. Trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to repair. The scars of betrayal run deep, and Harry understood that the road ahead would be long, painful, and unpredictable. Every interaction with Meghan, every conversation with family, every public engagement carried the risk of rekindling old wounds, creating new fractures, and deepening the sense of isolation that accompanied his decision. The magnitude of Harry's choice cannot be overstated. It was a turning point not just in his life, but in the life of the royal family, the institution, and the public perception of both. Cutting ties, in the context of centuries of tradition and expectation, was unprecedented. It was bold, dramatic, and fraught with consequences that would take years to fully unfold. And yet, in that decisive moment, Harry reclaimed control over his life, his family, and his future, an act of courage born of betrayal, grief, and an unyielding commitment to truth. But even as he embraced this new reality, one question loomed larger than any other. Would the consequences of his decision ultimately protect or destroy the very family he sought to safeguard? And what further revelations, hidden beneath layers of secrecy, might still be waiting to emerge, threatening to upend everything once again? Tears have a language of their own. They speak without words, cut deeper than any accusation, and reveal truths that even the strongest voice cannot convey. Meghan Markle's confession, the moment she uttered the words, "I'm sorry I lied," was exactly that kind of revelation. It was raw, unfiltered, and devastating, carrying with it consequences that would ripple through every corner of her life and Harry's, and eventually, the entire royal family. The confession didn't happen in front of cameras. It wasn't a public declaration staged for tabloids or televised interviews. It happened behind closed doors, in a space where the weight of truth was almost unbearable. Imagine the scene. Two people bound by love, loyalty, and shared experiences, now confronted with a fissure so profound that it threatened to fracture everything they had built. Meghan's eyes were red from crying. Her voice trembled. The words escaped in fragments, each syllable carrying years of fear, guilt, and regret. "I'm sorry I lied." 3 words. Simple. Yet the impact was anything but simple. For Harry, the words struck like a thunderclap. They confirmed what the DNA results had suggested, magnified the betrayal, and added a personal, emotional dimension that no scientific paper could convey. This was no longer about numbers, codes, or clinical certainty. It was about trust, intimacy, and the bond between husband and wife. Meghan's admission forced Harry to confront not only the factual reality of the DNA, but also the emotional truth. The person he had trusted most had deliberately withheld a fundamental secret. The confession unfolded in a tense, charged atmosphere. Harry, already reeling from the test results, experienced a whirlwind of emotions: anger, grief, disbelief, and a profound sense of loss. How could someone he loved, someone he had vowed to stand by through everything, carry such a secret for so long? The betrayal was not abstract. It was intimate, personal, and deeply human. Every promise, every shared experience, every quiet moment of intimacy was now shadowed by doubt and suspicion. Meghan, meanwhile, was not just confessing, she was baring her soul. Behind her tears was a recognition of the gravity of what she had done. She understood that the lie, no matter how justified in her mind, had consequences far beyond what she could have anticipated. She feared not only Harry's reaction, but also the long-term repercussions for their family, their children, and her own public image. The weight of secrecy, once carried privately, was now transformed into a confessional moment that would define the next chapter of their lives. The emotional intensity of the confession was heightened by the context in which it occurred. Harry was already emotionally raw, carrying the shock of the DNA results, the betrayal of trust, and the burden of responsibility for their children. Meghan's admission did not offer solace. It intensified the emotional landscape, adding layers of complexity to an already volatile situation. The tension between them was palpable, each silence loaded with unspoken questions. Why? How long? What now? Could trust ever be restored? And yet, within the emotional storm, there was also a strange clarity. Meghan's confession, as painful as it was, allowed for honesty that had been previously impossible. For Harry, it presented a moment to confront the reality of the situation directly, rather than navigating a maze of suspicion and uncertainty. The truth, raw and undeniable, now formed the foundation upon which difficult decisions would have to be made. The children, Archie and Lilibet, remained blissfully unaware of the emotional upheaval taking place. Yet, even in their innocence, the consequences of Meghan's confession would eventually reach them. Decisions about family life, schooling, and public appearances were now filtered through the lens of the lie that had been revealed. Every choice carried the dual responsibility of protecting the children from harm while addressing the reality of the situation. Harry's response to the confession was a mixture of measured resolve and emotional vulnerability. On one hand, he had to process the betrayal and protect himself emotionally. On the other, he had to consider the practical ramifications for his family and the palace. The path forward was fraught with uncertainty: confront publicly, manage privately, or find some hybrid approach that balanced accountability with protection. Each option carried risks, and the wrong move could exacerbate the situation, causing irreparable damage. The palace, of course, became an inevitable factor in the unfolding drama. Advisors and family members, though not present at the moment of confession, would eventually learn of it. The reverberations were immediate: whispered conversations, strategic planning, and speculation about the long-term implications for the monarchy. Every interaction between family members became a delicate negotiation, with the knowledge of the confession influencing decisions both big and small. Meghan's confession also had profound implications for her own sense of identity and agency. For years, she had navigated a world of intense scrutiny, balancing public image with personal authenticity. The decision to lie, or perhaps to withhold the full truth, had been influenced by multiple pressures: fear of judgment, desire to protect her children, and the complex dynamics of entering a centuries-old institution with its own rules and expectations. The confession, though painful, was a reclaiming of honesty, a step toward facing the consequences of actions long buried in secrecy. Emotionally, the moment marked a turning point in the couple's relationship. For Harry, it was an opportunity to confront the truth head-on, to redefine boundaries, and to make decisions grounded in reality rather than assumption. For Meghan, it was both a relief and a burden, a release of secrecy, but also an acknowledgement of the damage that secrecy had caused. The dynamic between them shifted immediately, moving from unspoken tension to a raw, emotionally charged interaction that would shape their future decisions. Yet, even in the midst of the confession, there were contradictions and complexities. Love and betrayal coexisted in the same space. Anger and understanding collided. The desire to protect children conflicted with the need to address deception. Harry and Meghan's emotions were a tangled web, reflecting the broader stakes of their lives: personal, familial, and public. This was not a simple story of right and wrong. It was a human drama of staggering complexity, played out behind closed doors, but destined to become a global spectacle. The confession also set the stage for public fallout. Though the moment was private, the implications could not remain contained forever. Advisors, family members, and eventually the media would learn of the revelation. Public opinion, already polarized, would be inflamed by the narrative of betrayal, secrecy, and emotional turmoil. The story, once it reached the public sphere, would challenge not only personal reputations, but also the perception of the monarchy itself. As Harry processed Meghan's words, he faced a crucial question: how to act in a way that honored both the truth and the well-being of their family. Decisions about trust, boundaries, and future interactions were now urgent. Every choice had to balance emotional reality with practical necessity, protecting the children, managing the public narrative, and preserving some sense of personal integrity. The stakes could not have been higher, and the margin for error was non-existent. By the end of the confession, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The revelation of the lie, coupled with the DNA results, had created a rupture in the family that could not be ignored. Trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild, and both Harry and Meghan would be forced to navigate the consequences in a world that offered no privacy, no refuge, and no guarantees. Every interaction, every decision, every public statement would now be colored by the knowledge of what had been hidden. And yet, amid the heartbreak and tension, there was a glimmer of resolution. The confession, painful as it was, represented a beginning. The first step toward confronting a reality that could no longer be avoided. But confronting the truth was only the start. The ripple effects, both private and public, were just beginning. How Harry chose to respond would define the next chapter of their lives, the children's lives, and the broader dynamics of the royal family. The palace has always been a place of tradition, ceremony, and carefully maintained appearances. Its walls have witnessed centuries of intrigue, strategy, and sometimes scandal, but nothing quite like this. The revelation of the DNA results, coupled with Meghan's tearful confession, sent shockwaves through the royal household, leaving every member scrambling to understand the implications, manage the optics, and navigate the shifting dynamics that now threatened to upend their carefully curated world. For Harry, the fallout was immediate and intense. The private shock of discovering the truth about his children had already rocked his world. But the palace, with its labyrinth of loyalties, hierarchies, and unspoken rules, added a new layer of complexity. Every conversation, every glance, every whispered word became a potential minefield. Allies and confidants, once reliable sources of support, suddenly carried new weight, as if their loyalties could shift at any moment depending on who knew what, and who was perceived to be in the right or wrong. The Queen, as ever, was a figure of calm authority, but the revelations challenged even her decades of experience. Reports of Meghan's confession and the DNA results filtered through discreet channels, forcing the monarchy to confront not only personal betrayals, but also the potential public fallout. Every advisor's suggestion was now scrutinized through a dual lens: personal loyalty and public perception. How could the royal household protect its image while dealing with such intimate and explosive information? How could centuries of tradition withstand the pressure of a private family crisis spilling toward public exposure? Prince Charles, Harry's father, found himself at a particularly difficult crossroads. Known for his careful diplomacy and patient maneuvering, he suddenly had to contend with a family dynamic that defied control. The trust between father and son, already fragile after years of tension, was tested to its limits. Charles had to balance the desire to support Harry with the need to uphold the integrity of the monarchy. Each word he spoke, each meeting he requested, carried weight. Missteps could escalate an already tense situation, creating fractures that might never heal. Prince William, Harry's older brother, experienced a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, there was empathy for his brother's pain and for the emotional turmoil the family now faced. On the other hand, there was frustration, confusion, and a sense of betrayal of his own. How could the family reconcile love with trust when the very foundation of what they believed about Harry's children was called into question? Tensions between the brothers, already simmering beneath the surface, now threatened to boil over into open conflict. The palace staff and advisors were also thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. Trusted aides, who had spent years maintaining the image of a unified and harmonious royal family, now had to navigate a landscape rife with secrecy, shifting loyalties, and moral dilemmas. Decisions that were once routine, scheduling meetings, arranging public appearances, drafting statements, suddenly became fraught with consequences. Every interaction, even casual or administrative, carried potential risk. One misstep could exacerbate the family rift or create unwanted media attention. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating in private corners of the palace. Rumors, speculation, and fragmented versions of the truth started to permeate conversations. Even the most loyal staff members found themselves caught between discretion and curiosity. In an institution where discretion has always been paramount, this tension was unprecedented. Those who knew bits of the story faced the agonizing dilemma of how much to reveal, to whom, and when. Every disclosure had ramifications, and the line between prudence and betrayal became increasingly blurred. Harry, acutely aware of the heightened stakes, began to consider the broader implications. His decision to cut ties with certain family members was no longer purely personal. It was entangled with the preservation of his own mental health, the protection of his children, and the need to navigate the uncharted waters of a family crisis with international visibility. Every move required careful calculation. Even the smallest gesture, whether an email, phone call, or meeting, had to be weighed against potential emotional fallout and public perception. Meghan's position in the palace was also precarious. Her confession had removed a layer of secrecy, but it had not eliminated the consequences of the lie itself. Every action she took was now under scrutiny, both from her husband and from the palace hierarchy. The confession, while an act of honesty, had inadvertently exposed her to judgment, criticism, and emotional pressure from multiple directions. She had revealed the truth, but the truth did not necessarily absolve her from the ramifications. The children, though shielded as much as possible, could not remain unaffected. Even in moments of innocence, the atmosphere in the palace had changed. The adults around them moved differently, spoke differently, and reacted differently. Archie and Lilibet, though young, were perceptive enough to sense shifts in tone and tension. The household's previously subtle patterns of behavior had been disrupted, leaving a sense of instability that even children could feel. Amid the personal fallout, the palace also had to consider the public implications. The royal family, a centuries-old institution built on perception, tradition, and ceremony, had always depended on a careful balance of privacy and transparency. Now, with Harry and Meghan at the center of an unprecedented personal scandal, the potential for public exposure was enormous. Advisors debated strategies for damage control, weighing the pros and cons of silence versus proactive messaging. Every decision involved the same delicate calculus: protect the family, maintain the monarchy's reputation, and manage the inevitable media attention. Yet, despite all the strategy and planning, there was no easy way to manage the emotional fallout. Personal feelings collided with institutional imperatives. Anger, disappointment, loyalty, and fear all competed for attention in the minds of those involved. Even the most composed members of the royal household were forced to confront feelings that were raw, immediate, and difficult to control. The balance between personal and public responsibility, already delicate, now teetered on the edge of collapse. The tension was palpable in every corner of the palace. Conversations were careful, measured, and often tinged with unspoken questions. Eye contact became loaded with meaning. Private meetings were charged with anticipation, as though everyone knew that the next disclosure could shift the balance of power, trust, and family dynamics. Loyalty, once assumed, was now questioned. Every interaction became a test of allegiance and judgment. Amid this turmoil, Harry and Meghan struggled to find common ground. They were united in protecting their children and navigating the immediate crisis, but the weight of past lies, recent revelations, and ongoing uncertainty created constant tension. Every decision, from where to live to how to communicate with family members, required negotiation, strategy, and emotional labor. It was a delicate dance, performed under pressure that most people could hardly imagine. The ripple effects of the fallout extended even further. Allies within the palace began to form subtle factions. Advisors weighed in on what actions should or should not be taken, and the media, sensing something monumental, started circling, waiting for the moment when the private storm would become public spectacle. The palace, a fortress of tradition and decorum, was suddenly navigating a crisis that was intensely personal, yet unavoidable in its potential for public exposure. And still, amidst all this chaos, Harry remained focused on the children. Every choice, every conversation, every strategic decision was measured against the potential impact on Archie and Lilibet. The palace, the family, and the public could all be managed in some way, but protecting the children required vigilance, care, and, above all, the courage to make decisions that prioritized their well-being over appearances or personal grievances. Yet even with this focus, there was no way to escape the truth. The fallout had only just begun. Every revelation, every confrontation, every decision made within the palace would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Relationships would be strained, loyalties tested, and secrets long buried would inevitably surface. The royal family, for all its history and tradition, was facing a storm unlike any it had encountered in living memory. The walls of Buckingham Palace have seen centuries of whispers, secrets, and power struggles, but nothing prepared it for the storm that was about to hit. The DNA revelation and Meghan's tearful confession had already shaken the family behind closed doors, but the world was about to learn that the royal family's carefully curated image was far more fragile than anyone could have imagined. And when the story finally broke to the public, the reaction was immediate, explosive, and relentless. Imagine waking up one morning to find that a private family crisis, once hidden behind palace walls and whispered conversations, has become global news. Headlines screamed betrayal, scandal, and controversy. Social media erupted, a wildfire of speculation, outrage, and fascination. Every tabloid and news outlet scrambled to report on what they framed as the most shocking royal revelation in decades. For Harry and Meghan, the private nightmare had suddenly become a public spectacle, and there was no escape. The first wave of media reports was overwhelming. Journalists framed the story in sensational terms, often exaggerating details to capture attention. Words like betrayal, secret DNA, and shocking confession dominated the headlines. Public opinion polarized almost instantly. Some expressed sympathy for Harry, praising his courage and protecting his children. Others criticized Meghan, painting her as deceitful and manipulative. And in the middle of it all, the children, Archie and Lilibet, remained unaware of the tidal wave of attention surrounding them. Their innocence now contrasted sharply with the chaos engulfing their parents. Royal commentators and media insiders offered endless analysis, dissecting every possible angle. Experts debated motives, consequences, and the broader implications for the monarchy. Public forums buzzed with speculation. Who knew what and when? How would Harry respond publicly? Could Meghan ever regain trust? The story became more than a family drama. It was now a cultural phenomenon, a spectacle that captivated millions around the globe. The palace, predictably, moved quickly to manage the fallout. Statements were carefully crafted, emphasizing family privacy while attempting to quell rumors. Advisors worked behind the scenes, negotiating with the press, and trying to control the narrative. But in the age of social media, control was nearly impossible. Leaks, speculation, and viral content ensured that the story spread faster than the palace could respond. Every day brought new revelations, new interviews, and new opinions, amplifying the scandal and keeping the family at the center of a global conversation. Harry, already emotionally exhausted from the private turmoil, now had to navigate the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. Every public appearance, every statement, every interview became a minefield. Critics questioned his motives, supporters rallied behind him, and the media pounced on even the smallest missteps. The emotional toll was immense. Anger, frustration, and exhaustion became constant companions. The pressure of protecting his children, managing public perception, and dealing with personal betrayal was almost unbearable. Meghan faced an equally daunting challenge. Her confession had made the private truth known to Harry, but now the public was dissecting every possible detail. She became the target of intense criticism, her every action and statement analyzed for signs of guilt, remorse, or manipulation. Online harassment escalated, and media outlets speculated about her character, her motives, and the impact of the DNA revelation. The pressure was relentless, and for a woman already navigating an unprecedented public role, the scrutiny was suffocating. The scandal also strained relationships within the royal family. Conversations that had been private became public fodder. Tensions between Harry and William intensified, fueled by speculation about loyalty, responsibility, and family unity. Prince Charles faced criticism for how the family handled the situation, while the Queen had to balance personal disappointment with her role as the public face of stability. Every interaction, whether private or public, carried the weight of the story now dominating headlines worldwide. Legal and logistical considerations added another layer of complexity. Questions about custody, privacy, and public statements became urgent. Advisors debated what could be disclosed, what should remain private, and how to protect the children from the escalating scrutiny. Every decision had consequences, and there was no clear roadmap for handling a scandal of this magnitude. The DNA revelation, combined with Meghan's confession and the ensuing media frenzy, created a perfect storm with no precedent in modern royal history. Public reactions were intense and emotional. Social media platforms became battlegrounds, with supporters and critics clashing over interpretations of events. Opinion polls reflected a divided public. Some expressed outrage at Meghan's deception, others condemned the palace for perceived hypocrisy or lack of transparency. Hashtags, trending topics, and viral commentary kept the story alive in the public consciousness, ensuring that the royal family remained under an unrelenting microscope. Yet, amidst the chaos, Harry and Meghan sought to maintain some semblance of control. Private conversations focused on protecting the children, strategizing next steps, and determining how to respond to the media. The balance between transparency and privacy became a constant negotiation, one that required diplomacy, emotional resilience, and tactical thinking. Every move was calculated, every word measured, and every action scrutinized, not just by the public, but by family members, advisors, and critics alike. The scandal also prompted a re-examination of historical precedents. Pundits and historians analyzed previous royal controversies, comparing and contrasting reactions and outcomes. Some argued that this revelation could mark a turning point in how the monarchy is perceived globally. Others suggested that the combination of personal betrayal and public exposure could have long-term consequences for the institution itself. The DNA revelation, once private and contained, had grown into a public crisis with implications that extended far beyond Harry and Meghan's immediate family. Even within the palace walls, the atmosphere was charged. Staff whispered in corridors, courtiers exchanged cautious glances, and advisors strategized relentlessly. The scandal had exposed vulnerabilities that had long been hidden behind ceremonial pomp and centuries of tradition. Every relationship, every loyalty, and every hierarchy was now subject to scrutiny. The palace, an institution designed to weather storms, found itself navigating